At 9:30 in the morning on May 1, 1942, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki stood in the vast converted mess hall of the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. Around him, junior officers arranged wooden blocks on a massive game table, each representing fleets, carriers, and battleships across the Pacific Ocean. The room hummed with anticipation. 20 senior admirals in crisp dress uniforms filed in, each accompanied by aides carrying folders thick with operational plans, intelligence reports, and logistical charts. This was not a casual exercise. This was a war game, designed to simulate the largest naval operation Japan had ever attempted. The attack on Midway Island, 1,400 miles northwest of Hawaii. The plan had been meticulously crafted by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's most audacious strategist. His vision: lure the American carriers into a trap, annihilate them in a single decisive engagement, and force the United States to sue for peace. On paper, it was brilliant, almost flawless in conception, requiring precise coordination of hundreds of ships, submarines, and aircraft across thousands of miles of ocean. Yet the game itself was compromised before it even began. Ugaki, chief umpire and Yamamoto's trusted chief of staff, controlled the rules. Whenever the dice, which simulated the chaotic uncertainties of combat, predicted Japanese losses or setbacks, he intervened. A roll indicating disaster could simply be reinterpreted to ensure a Japanese victory. The games, 4 days of orchestrated simulation aboard the Yamato in the inland sea of Japan, were less about discovering weaknesses than confirming an illusion of invincibility. Japan drunk on victory. In May 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed itself unstoppable. In the previous 6 months, Japan had carved out an empire stretching from the Aleutians to the Dutch East Indies. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, had sunk or damaged 8 American battleships and killed over 2,400 men. Within hours, Japanese bombers destroyed most of the American Air Force in the Philippines. 2 days later, Japanese aircraft sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse, demonstrating the vulnerability of even the largest warships to air attack. By early 1942, Hong Kong had fallen, Manila was occupied, Singapore had surrendered, and the Dutch East Indies were under Japanese control, securing vital oil resources. Aircraft carriers like Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had struck across the Pacific without suffering losses, while Mitsubishi A6M0 pilots dominated the skies, out-turning, out-climbing, and outranging any Allied aircraft they faced. Victory disease, the overconfidence born from repeated unbroken success, infected Japanese planning. Leaders at every level assumed that past victories guaranteed future success. The war game's setup. The Yamato, 72,000 tons of steel and firepower, anchored at Hashira, provided the perfect venue. Its mess hall had been stripped of furniture and replaced with a 40-foot table mapped to scale, with Midway, Hawaii, and the surrounding ocean grids carefully laid out. Wooden blocks represented every ship, color-coded by type, name, and operational role. Pins marked positions and projected movements. Dice would determine combat outcomes, introducing randomness meant to reflect the unpredictability of real warfare. Umpires consulted damage tables, calculated fuel consumption, and adjudicated battles, unless, of course, a senior officer intervened. The scenario was comprehensive. Not only would the war game simulate the carrier strike on Midway, but it would also test the diversionary attack on the Aleutians, troop landings on the island, submarine deployments, battleship bombardment, and the establishment of Japanese airfields. In theory, This simulation was to save lives by identifying flaws before real ships faced real bullets. In practice, the game became a performance. Officers were eager for affirmation, not correction. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the carrier strike force, remained quiet, aware that Yamamoto's staff distrusted him. His decisions during the Pearl Harbor attack had been second-guessed, and he knew dissent could end his career. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, leading the invasion fleet, voiced concerns about logistics. Supplying Midway, nearly 1,400 miles from the nearest Japanese base, would be a nightmare. Yet these warnings were noted and then ignored. The plan had been approved. Dice and deception. By the second day, Japanese aircraft were attacking Midway in the simulation. A junior officer, playing the American side, launched land-based bombers at the Japanese carriers while their decks were full of aircraft preparing for the next wave. A move that, in real combat, could have destroyed carriers. Dice were rolled. The tables indicated that 2 Japanese carriers, Akagi and Kaga, were sunk. Ugaki intervened. 2 carriers sunk? Impossible. Adjustments were made. Akagi was merely damaged. Only Kaga was sunk. Later, Kaga mysteriously reappeared for the next operational phase, illustrating how the simulation had been manipulated to ensure a narrative of Japanese success. Even the scenario of American carriers moving preemptively was ruled impossible. The war game assumed the Americans would wait at Pearl Harbor, exactly as Yamamoto intended, ignoring the reality that U.S. commanders were capable of aggressive maneuvers. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's finest tacticians, warned that early American deployment could ruin the plan. His concerns were dismissed. By the end of 4 days, the war game confirmed exactly what Japan's leadership wanted to see. Japanese carriers would triumph, the Midway operation would succeed, and America would be forced to negotiate. Confidence was high, but built entirely on manipulated simulations and wishful thinking. Lies, codes, and the reality of intelligence. Japan's planners' confidence rested on 3 critical errors: flawed intelligence, underestimated American strength, and incorrect assumptions about timing. Intelligence misperception. Japan believed its strategic surprise was guaranteed. Yet Commander Joseph Roche and his team at Station Haipo in Hawaii had already broken portions of the Japanese naval code JN-25. By April, they knew Japan was planning a major operation against a target codenamed AF, Midway. A fabricated radio message about water shortages on Midway confirmed Japanese suspicions. By the time the operation began, Japan was unaware that their plans were fully known to the Americans. American carrier strength. Japanese planners assumed only 2 carriers remained operational after the Battle of the Coral Sea. In reality, Yorktown, thought to be sunk, had survived extensive damage and would rejoin the fleet. Japan believed 4 carriers against 2 inexperienced Americans ensured victory. The math seemed simple. Timing assumptions. The war games assumed the Americans would not sortie until the Midway attack began. Nimitz, however, deployed Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown to Point Luck, northeast of Midway, well before the Japanese fleet arrived. By June 4, 1942, when the attack began, Japan's overconfidence, built during the war games, would collide with meticulously prepared American forces, leading to one of the most decisive naval battles in history. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the first rays of dawn barely touched the horizon over the Pacific when Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched the opening strike from his 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The first wave consisted of 36 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M-0 fighters providing escort. Their target, Midway Island, where American defenses were still alert but unprepared for the scale of the Japanese assault. At the same time, Nagumo dispatched 7 reconnaissance aircraft to search for the American fleet. Yet even this seemingly simple task faltered. Too few planes were assigned to cover a vast ocean. Mechanical issues delayed takeoffs, weather hampered visibility. A critical scout from the cruiser Tone was delayed by 30 minutes, a delay that would prove catastrophic, though no one aboard could foresee it yet. The initial strike achieved partial success. Bombs and torpedoes inflicted damage on Midway's airfields and installations, but the island's defenses remained operational. Reports came back requesting a follow-up strike. Nagumo made a fateful decision. The second wave of aircraft, initially armed with torpedoes to strike enemy ships, was ordered rearmed with bombs for another attack on land targets. Deck crews worked frantically, removing torpedoes, bringing planes down into hangars, swapping weapons, and returning aircraft to the flight deck. The process created organized chaos, leaving the carriers exposed, decks crowded with fully armed planes, fueled and ready to ignite. By 0728, one of Nagumo's delayed scouts finally reported sighting American ships. The message was vague, no confirmation of carriers, no precise locations. Nagumo hesitated. Should he continue rearming for a second strike on Midway, or should he redirect for an attack on the American fleet? Orders were given, changed, and reversed. Each adjustment consumed precious minutes, leaving flight decks cluttered with planes laden with bombs and torpedoes, a perfect target. Torpedo squadrons fly to certain death. At 9:30 a.m., the first American attacks began. Torpedo Squadron 8, launched from Hornet, approached without fighter escort. Led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, 15 Douglas TBD Devastators flew directly toward the Japanese carriers. Waldron reportedly told his men, "If only one of you gets through to launch a torpedo, the mission is a success." The Japanese defenders, Zeros from the Cap, swarmed the slow, lumbering torpedo bombers. Anti-aircraft fire lit the sky. One by one, planes were shot down, some exploding mid-air, others crashing into the ocean. A few managed to release torpedoes, all of which were easily avoided by the agile carriers. In the end, every aircraft except one was destroyed. Ensign George Gay, who floated among the wreckage for 30 hours, witnessing the carnage from the surface. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise followed, 14 Devastators attacking from another angle. Again, Zeros and anti-aircraft fire decimated the formation. No torpedoes hit their targets. Then came Yorktown Squadron, 13 Devastators with fighter escort. 12 were lost. Across all 3 squadrons, 41 aircraft attacked, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo struck. Yet the sacrifice was not meaningless. Their attacks forced Japanese fighters to low altitude, scattering the Cap across miles of ocean and left the carriers' decks vulnerable from above. The stage was set for the next wave, the dive bombers. The dive bombers strike. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey of Enterprise, running low on fuel after an exhaustive search for the Japanese fleet, spotted the wake of the destroyer Arashi at 10 a.m. Following the ship northeast, McCluskey led 37 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers on a near-vertical assault toward Kaga and Akagi. 2 minutes later, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading 17 more Dauntless from Yorktown, dove towards Soryu. The Japanese fleet was unprepared. Fighters were drawn down to low altitude, anti-aircraft gunners were focused on torpedo bombers, and the deck was crowded with fully armed, fueled, and ready-to planes. Within 5 minutes, the course of the Pacific War shifted irrevocably. Kaga received 4 bomb hits. The first penetrated the flight deck near the forward elevator. The next three struck midships. Bombs exploded amid armed aircraft and torpedoes, igniting aviation fuel, detonating ordnance, and triggering massive secondary explosions. Within minutes, the carrier was engulfed in flames. Despite firefighting efforts, the ship was unsalvageable. Around 800 men perished. Akagi was hit once near the midship elevator. The bomb detonated among fully armed aircraft. Chain reactions tore through the decks and fires raged uncontrollably. Nagumo abandoned the carrier, transferring his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. Akagi burned overnight and was scuttled the following morning. Soryu suffered 3 hits in as many minutes. Like the others, the bombs struck densely packed hangars, igniting fuel and ordnance. Explosions tore the ship apart. By evening, it too sank, taking nearly 700 men with her. 3 carriers destroyed in 5 minutes. The exact scenario that Dice had predicted in the war games, the one that Ugaki had ruled impossible. Hiryu strikes back. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, operating separately, escaped the initial attack. Commander Yamaguchi launched a counterattack. Hiryu's planes found Yorktown, putting 3 bombs into her at noon. The damage control crews aboard Yorktown worked miracles, keeping the carrier afloat and operational. Returning Japanese aircraft, believing they attacked a fully intact carrier, delivered 2 torpedoes into Yorktown later that afternoon. The damage proved fatal, forcing Captain Elliot Buckmaster to order the ship abandoned. At the end of June 4th, Japan had lost all 4 of the carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the same carriers that had symbolized Japanese dominance in the Pacific. Over 3,000 sailors and aviators perished, including many of the most experienced pilots. Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond were America's only losses in this exchange, totaling 307 men. The role of overconfidence. The disaster at Midway did not happen by accident. Every error, from delayed reconnaissance to chaotic deck operations, was amplified by overconfidence nurtured during the war games aboard Yamato. Ugaki's dismissal of realistic threats, the assumption that Americans would act predictably, and the manipulation of dice results created a fatal blind spot. The Japanese fleet sailed into battle unprepared for the exact scenario predicted by simulations. The unnamed junior officer, playing the American side in the war games, had anticipated precisely how the battle would unfold, but his warnings were ignored. The belief in invincibility, reinforced during those 4 days of orchestrated war games, had blinded Japan to reality. By mid-1942, Japan's industrial and military momentum had begun to falter, though few outside a tight circle of planners realized it. Shipyards strained under impossible demands, building new carriers while repairing older vessels, competing for steel, labor, and scarce resources. Aircraft factories, operating near the front lines of Japan's sprawling empire, worked under constant threat of air attack as American bombers penetrated deeper into the home islands. Every new plane produced, every repair completed, became a race against time and attrition. Pilot training was a critical bottleneck. Japan's carrier aviators had once been unmatched, elite professionals who mastered aerial combat in the skies over China and the Pacific. But the war had consumed these experienced men faster than the system could replace them. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the result was catastrophic. Japanese pilots were raw, inexperienced, and unequipped to face veteran American aviators. The Americans called the ensuing slaughter the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a brutal testament to the consequences of attrition compounded by overconfidence. Ugaki survived Midway, though his reputation quietly suffered in the inner circles of the Japanese Navy. He continued as Yamamoto's chief of staff through 1943, navigating the increasingly dire strategic situation. In April 1943, during Yamamoto's inspection flight over Bougainville, Ugaki was present when P-38 Lightning fighters, guided by intercepted Japanese radio transmissions, ambushed and shot down Yamamoto's aircraft. Ugaki survived, but with severe injuries that would haunt him for the remainder of the war. He continued serving, commanding battleship divisions and shore bases,
all the while maintaining a meticulous diary. Those pages reveal a man torn between loyalty to the strategy he helped craft and the dawning realization that Japan's war was lost. He acknowledged mistakes in planning and execution, but never fully accepted responsibility for the flawed war games that had validated an inherently doomed plan. The final chapter of Ugaki's life came on August 15, 1945. Japan had surrendered. Emperor Hirohito's voice, broadcast across the nation, confirmed what months of defeats had already made inevitable. Ugaki, defiant to the end, led an unauthorized kamikaze mission over Okinawa, flying a bomber into the teeth of American ships. He died in the attack, one of the last casualties of a war prolonged by overconfidence, rigid planning, and a refusal to accept inconvenient truths. The story of the Midway War Games remained hidden for over a decade. Military records were destroyed, lost, or classified. Officers who had witnessed the rigged exercises either perished in combat or kept silent under a code of loyalty and fear. It was not until 1955 that the first detailed public account emerged in the book Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, written by Captain Mitsuo Fuchida and Commander Masatake Okumiya. Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike and served aboard Akagi during Midway, described the operational games in detail. Okumiya, the umpire whose dice roll had been altered by Ugaki, revealed the manipulations that made a catastrophic outcome impossible in the eyes of Japanese leadership. Their revelations shocked readers in both Japan and the United States. The Japanese military had known the plan's vulnerabilities, but pressed forward anyway. Some historians questioned minor details, noting Fuchida's occasional exaggerations. But the essential truth stood unchallenged. Ugaki intervened in the war games, adjusting dice rolls to minimize predicted losses. The Midway Games validated a flawed strategy and lured Japan toward disaster. Modern military doctrine treats these war games as a cautionary tale. Professional officers study the exercises as examples of confirmation bias, the human tendency to accept only information that validates pre-existing beliefs while dismissing inconvenient truths. War games are supposed to reveal weaknesses, not hide them. When the rules of a simulation are manipulated to favor a desired outcome, the lessons it provides are fundamentally distorted. The United States, by contrast, approached Midway with rigor and honesty. American war games exposed multiple avenues of failure. Nimitz positioned his carriers and reconnaissance carefully, understanding that even a small misstep could prove fatal. American success was not accidental. It was built on disciplined planning, extensive intelligence work, and the capacity to act decisively when opportunity arose. The 5 minutes in which Japanese carriers burned required months of preparation, painstaking training, and the application of precise intelligence. Japan, by contrast, had advantages it could not exploit: more experienced pilots, superior aircraft, and a numerically larger fleet. But the Japanese command suffered from overconfidence, rigid planning, and a culture that punished dissent. When Ugaki altered the dice to prevent predicted losses, he chose certainty over reality. When the war game foretold disaster, the Japanese admirals refused to accept it. And, in just 5 minutes on June 4, 1942, reality corrected their illusions. 4 carriers burnt, and nearly 3,000 sailors and aviators perished. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was shattered. The wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Tsuryu, and Huryu now rest in over 17,000 feet of water northwest of Midway. Modern deep-sea surveys, using remotely operated vehicles, have revealed the condition of these sunken warships. Akagi lies upright, her bow sheer and way. Kaga rests inverted, shattered by internal explosions. Tsuryu and Huryu are scattered across miles of ocean floor. These vessels are protected war graves and serve as sobering reminders of the human cost of strategic hubris. The heroism of the American torpedo bomber crews, who attacked with near-suicidal courage despite obsolete equipment, is studied alongside the tactical brilliance of dive bomber pilots from Enterprise and Yorktown. But the story of the war games imparts a different lesson, one that transcends naval history. It is a lesson about organizational culture, leadership, and the perils of valuing appearance over truth. Ugaki's dice predicted the disaster. The Japanese command rejected it. Confidence mattered more than reality, and the price was catastrophic. The Midway War Games teach us that the most dangerous moment in any plan is when everyone agrees it cannot fail. When uncomfortable truths are ignored, when dissent is silenced, when tests are rigged to confirm rather than challenge, failure becomes inevitable. The story of Midway is more than history. It is a warning. Whether in warfare, business, or governance, the consequences of ignoring inconvenient realities are universal and unforgiving. The dice were right, the admiral was wrong, and 3,000 men paid the ultimate price.
The immediate aftermath of Midway was catastrophic for Japan, but the human dimension of the disaster often gets lost amid the statistics. Thousands of young men, experienced pilots, navigators, and sailors, were gone in a matter of minutes. Families received telegrams instead of bodies. Lives ended far from home in a foreign ocean, beneath waves that would become silent witnesses to history. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. Many officers and sailors grappled with guilt, shame, and the realization that their sacrifices had been rendered futile by flawed leadership and overconfidence. Ugaki himself, despite surviving the battle, carried the burden of these losses in silence. His diaries reveal moments of private anguish and reflection, the kind of thoughts that would never have been voiced in the rigid hierarchy of the Japanese Navy. He wrote about mistakes and miscalculations, but institutional culture demanded stoicism and loyalty above all else. This internal conflict highlights a tragic irony. Those most aware of the failings of strategy were powerless to correct them without jeopardizing their careers or their lives. Strategically, Midway marked a turning point in the Pacific War. Japan lost its initiative, and the United States began a methodical campaign to reclaim territory, island by island, across the Pacific. The destruction of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, shifted the balance of naval air power permanently. Japan's remaining carriers were few, their pilots inexperienced, and their resources stretched thin across a sprawling empire that could no longer support offensive operations at the same scale. Modern analysis of the battle highlights the interplay between intelligence, timing, and leadership decisions. American cryptographers had broken Japanese codes, providing Admiral Nimitz with a critical advantage. But intelligence alone did not win the battle. It merely offered a chance, an opportunity that required flawless execution. American commanders positioned carriers with surgical precision, timed dive bomber attacks to the minute, and maintained operational discipline that Japanese forces could no longer match. In contrast, Japanese planning suffered from structural flaws. Overconfidence, rigid doctrine, and an unwillingness to challenge authority prevented adaptive thinking. The war games had predicted the disaster, but instead of revising the plan, senior officers chose to ignore it. Ugaki's manipulation of the dice was emblematic of a broader cultural failure, a hierarchy in which questioning senior leaders was tantamount to disloyalty. This dynamic ensured that vulnerabilities were never addressed, procedures were never improved, and human lives were needlessly sacrificed. The lessons extend far beyond naval warfare. Organizational theory and modern military doctrine alike cite Midway as an example of confirmation bias and groupthink in action. Leaders who reward consensus and punish dissent create environments where failures are hidden, warnings are suppressed, and errors compound until disaster becomes inevitable. It is a story as relevant to boardrooms and governments as it is to fleets at sea. In the decades following the war, wrecks were explored with remote technology, revealing the final resting places of the carriers and the haunting scale of destruction. Akagi lies upright with her bow sheared away, a ghostly monument to hubris. Kaga rests inverted, her massive hull fractured by internal explosions. Soryu and Hiryu are scattered over miles of ocean floor, silent memorials to the pilots who never returned. International agreements now protect these sites, ensuring they remain hallowed ground for study and remembrance. Yet the human story persists beyond wrecks and strategy. Survivors' accounts describe confusion, fear, and valor in moments when everything seemed lost.
Torpedo bomber crews faced near-suicidal odds, diving into enemy fire with obsolete planes against armored decks bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Dive bomber pilots executed their attacks with precise timing, their success contingent on split-second decisions and relentless courage. Both sides endured losses, yet the Japanese suffered not only tactical defeat, but the collapse of an operational culture that had failed to adapt to the realities of modern warfare. Today, Midway is taught in naval academies worldwide, not just as a victory for the United States, but as a warning. Strategy divorced from reality is a path to disaster. Leaders must seek truth, welcome bad news, and design exercises that reveal flaws, not hide them. The Japanese war games of 1942 illustrate what happens when human nature, pride, and rigid hierarchy override logic and foresight. The dice had predicted disaster. The Japanese command refused to listen. And in 5 devastating minutes, reality intervened. History preserved both the triumph and the tragedy, ensuring that future generations could learn the consequences of ignoring inconvenient truths. The carrier's resting places now lie undisturbed, thousands of feet beneath the waves. Yet their stories continue to teach, caution, and inspire. Courage, intelligence, and preparation can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds, but only when leaders are willing to confront reality, not just the version they wish to see.
The story of Midway does not end with sinking ships or broken aircraft. It lingers in the human decisions, the hidden errors, and the choices leaders made when confronted with inconvenient truths. Ugaki's life, like the battle itself, is a cautionary tale. A man of skill and intelligence, he was bound by loyalty, pride, and cultural expectations that left little room for dissent. His intervention at the war games, adjusting the dice to avoid predicted losses, was not merely an act of optimism. It was a reflection of a system in which challenging authority was unthinkable. After the war, historians would debate responsibility, dissecting who made the critical mistakes and why. Some placed blame squarely on Nagumo, the fleet admiral in command at Midway. Others noted the failures of the higher command structure, including Ugaki, whose choices at the war games symbolized a broader unwillingness to confront uncomfortable realities. The lesson is universal. When institutions prioritize appearances over truth, when plans are valued more than evidence, failure becomes inevitable. Ugaki's final act, a kamikaze mission over Okinawa after Japan's surrender, reflects a man caught between duty and despair. It is both tragic and symbolic. By choosing to die in a final, futile attack, he embodied the consequences of a system that punished critical thinking and rewarded conformity. His death, like the loss of the carriers he once helped plan for, is a reminder that strategic miscalculations are not just abstract, they cost lives. The Japanese Navy learned too late that war games must expose vulnerability, not confirm optimism. The United States, by contrast, demonstrated the value of rigorous, honest exercises that tested assumptions, identified weak points, and allowed leaders to plan accordingly. The contrast between these approaches underscores a timeless principle. Success is rarely the result of chance. It is earned through preparation, assessment, and the courage to confront harsh realities. Today, professional military education continues to honor the lessons of Midway. Courses in naval strategy, organizational leadership, and intelligence studies repeatedly reference the battle and its war games. The story serves as both an operational guide and a moral lesson. Leaders are taught to encourage dissent, embrace difficult truths, and design exercises that reveal weaknesses rather than mask them. The narrative of the dice, ignored, manipulated, and ultimately proven correct, remains a powerful metaphor for the dangers of confirmation bias and institutional arrogance. Midway's wrecks, lying in silence beneath the Pacific waves, stand as enduring symbols. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu are more than historical relics. They are testaments to human courage, flawed decision-making, and the brutal clarity of war. Surveys by deep-sea vehicles continue to document their condition, preserving evidence for future generations. Researchers study them not only for their technical and tactical significance, but as reminders of the lives lost and the lessons embedded in every twisted hull and shattered deck. The human stories, however, are not confined to the ships or the strategic maps. They live in diaries, letters, and accounts from survivors and historians. They live in the reflection of every officer who has faced the tension between truth and loyalty, between caution and overconfidence. They live in the cautionary tales told in classrooms, boardrooms, and training exercises worldwide. The warnings of 1942 remain relevant. Success depends not on optimism, but on confronting reality, accepting mistakes, and fostering a culture where inconvenient truths can be heard. As we reflect on the events of June 1942, it is clear that the greatest danger in any plan is not external, the enemy, the storm, or the terrain, but internal. It lies in the human mind, in the willingness to ignore warnings, to suppress dissent, and to believe that destiny can be shaped by hope rather than evidence. Midway was a crucible of strategy, courage, and failure, a defining moment where the difference between truth and wishful thinking decided the fate of nations. The story ends not with a triumphant victory or a lament of loss, but with understanding that leadership demands honesty, humility, and vigilance, that war and life punishes those who ignore warning signs, that courage is not only in the attack, but in the willingness to confront reality and make hard choices. If you take one lesson from Midway, let it be this: the dice may predict disaster, but only those brave enough to face it can change the outcome. History remembers the bold, honors the courageous, and teaches the wise. And in the silent depths where Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rest, the truth of those 5 fateful minutes endures, an eternal testament to the cost of overconfidence, the price of ignoring reality, and the enduring power of lessons learned too late. History is not only written in victories and defeats, but in the choices leaders make when facing uncomfortable truths. Midway reminds us that overconfidence, pride, and silence in the face of warning signs can have devastating consequences, lessons that resonate far beyond the battlefield. The carriers may rest in the deep, but the human story, the strategies tested and ignored, and the courage of those who fought live on. If this story gave you a deeper understanding of World War II, of the sacrifices made, and the hard lessons history teaches, make sure you don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now to explore more untold stories from the Second World War. Like this video if you value learning from the past, and leave a comment to tell us where you're watching from and which historical moment you'd like us to uncover next. Because remembering history is not just about the past, it's about shaping the wisdom for the future.